Okay, welcome back to our series of classes on fundamental questions in Judaism. And today we're starting a series of classes where we're going to discuss God. God is a very fundamental concept in Judaism. It's so fundamental that surprisingly, it's not learned very much in high schools or yeshiva. God is always an assumption that people believe in or declare they believe in when they choose to be religious. Many times people have discussions regarding God, but usually they surround the proofs of God's existence. And while that's important, discussing God is of tremendous importance, not only for our philosophical and understanding of ourselves and relationship to the world, but also, as we'll see, it has halachic implications regarding what is God, what can we say about God, what do we understand about God, and more importantly, what is God's relationship to us, human beings, and the world as general. So we're going to start with a series of classes where we're going to discuss what was discussed about God. Now we'll start out by saying that God being infinite and is definitely beyond man's understanding. So we could just end the class now by saying, what is God? We do not understand, and that is all we have to say. But as we'll see, our sages and throughout the ages weren't satisfied with that answer. Yes, it is true that we do not know God himself. We do not talk about God himself, but there is still something to be said about God. And we're going to see various discussions that surround what we can say about God, and through those discussions get a better understanding of what we are talking about when we discuss about God, and when we say God, and when one says he believes in God, what does he mean? At the end, we're also going to move. That's probably going to be in a different class, where we're going to discuss those famous proofs of the existence of God and the disproofs, which is as important when you want to understand why smart atheists don't believe in God, understand their point of view as well. Let's begin. Okay, so the first question that's already discussed in the Torah itself regarding God is God's image. God's image the image of God appears surprisingly too many times in the Torah, or many times. Man is created in the image of God, hinting that God has an image. And Mamad Har Sinai says that people saw something. They saw feet, they saw a chair, and they saw God's hand in Egypt. Etzba Elohimu, the finger of God, as said by Pharaoh's magicians. So there are definitely references in the Torah itself to the image of God, God having a shape or a form. The prophets as well, Chezkel, Daniel, all describe a vision of God as seeing something. Now, we know these visions not to be God himself. How do we know this? The Torah itself testifies. In Mamad Har Sinai, after the Torah describes an image, the Torah goes out of its way to tell us, Hishamer me'od, nishmartem me'od nafshetechem, be very careful on your souls to remember that you did not see any image in Har Sinai. Therefore, it's commonly accepted that all the descriptions of images of God are mere metaphors to better understanding God. To help human beings better understand God, there are visions of images of God. But still, one has to ask, okay, then why so many metaphors? Why does the Torah not simply describe God as imageless? So there are three approaches that are discussed. The first approach is the Rambam, and he goes what's more commonly known. These are all metaphors with a message to better understand what God is. And if you're smart enough, you can learn from the way they describe the image something that you otherwise would not know about God. Others, commentaries like the Ramchal, say they are not metaphors, rather visions that prophets have, that the vision is part of the prophecy. Part of the prophecy is the vision, and therefore it's not seeing God, it's the representative of God in the vision, which has a meaning in itself that is only known to the rabbi / prophet who has that vision. In ancient Jewish sources, you will find many references to God chas v'chilei having an image, up to an extent where there's a famous Ravid that goes against the Rambam, who calls a heretic to anybody who believes, even fathoms, that God has an image. The Ravid says, how can you call them a heretic? Big rabbis have thought that as well. And the Ravid is not willing to agree that they're heretics. The Ravid agrees with the Rambam that God has no image, but it bothered him to call heretics to people that their entire sin was just reading the psukim of the Torah and taking them literal, in a literal fashion. Can we call them heretics? The Rambam says yes. The Ravid says, well, I agree with the Rambam, God has no image, I'm not willing to call them heretics. So it is, except for the exception of some radical commentaries, it is commonly accepted that God has no image. There are some Hasidic writings that try to melamed zchut on those rabbis, that those texts that take the image of God as literal, saying that God can take a form, but that is not God himself, rather a form created by God. To better understand this, we'll have to discuss what does it mean to discuss the question rather whether God is immanent to the world or outside the world, and we're going to discuss that in a later date. But going back to what we've discussed, Rov minyan binyan, it's commonly accepted by all, we can say all rabbis throughout the ages, that God, chas v'chilei, does not have an image, and even giving God an image is avodah zarah. It is for that reason that the Rambam declares the Christians as idol worshippers for giving God an image. The second topic has to do with, we call it Achdut Hashem. Achdut Hashem, we all know that God is one. That's what we're taught every day. And we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. And that has to do with the concept of God not being physical. Since God, why is God not physical? Because anything physical is limited. And in order to limit someone or something has to be more powerful to limit. And since God is limitless, therefore nothing can limit him, therefore he is not physical. That's the philosophical claim, ancient Greek philosophical claim, to prove that if God is limitless, Sophie, and then he also cannot be physical, because anything physical is by definition limited to the size and shape. That understanding also explains why God must be one. God must be one because if God is not one, that means God ends at a certain point and then there's room for something else outside of God. And since God is limitless, therefore that doesn't leave room for anything outside of God. Now, if God is one, what does that mean, one? So the Rambam goes out of his way to explain that one does not mean the number one, that God, there's only one God and not many gods, even though that is true. Judaism, being monotheistic, believes there's only one source of power, one God, and not many sources of power that created the world or that run the world. Yet when we declare Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, we're not declaring that there's only that there's one source, one God. We're declaring something much deeper, and that is God is one, and that he cannot be split into different pieces, different parts. Human beings, we have our intelligence, we have our knowledge, we have our experiences. God is one entity that is not splittable. It's not different parts of God. That's how the Rambam describes God. God is all one entity. Do we fully understand that? No. It's very hard for human beings to understand how one thing can be only one entity, because we are used to things having a time, a place, a color, but God is one. How does that work, or does it work with the Kabbalistic idea of Sefirot? Is a big and fascinating argument between the Kabbalistic world and the Rambamistic approach to God. The Kabbalistic world, following the Zohar and the teachings of the Ari, describe, while they agree that God is one, they describe what they call 10 Sefirot, 10 spheres, 10 different levels of God's revelation. And it was heavily discussed amongst rabbis at that time. Does that agree? How does that, with the Rambam's understanding and the common understanding of God being one? If God is one, how can we break up God into 10 separate sefirot? You have Hod, Yesod, Tiferet, all these different Malchut, all these different sefirot that the Kabbalistic world describes various revelations of God. How does that work with this idea, this concept that God is one? And many rabbis said it doesn't. And there's one rabbi that went as far as saying that while the Christians believe in the Trinity, in the three, these rabbis believe in the 10. They break God into 10 parts. But many of the Achronim, the Ramchal leading the way, said there is no contradiction. And that even when the Kabbalistic world talk about Sefirot, different levels of revelation of God, they're not talking about God himself. They're talking about different revelations of God. The revelation of God is not God himself, rather how God appears to run and appear in the world. And therefore, when we say God is one, we're talking about God himself. God himself is one. God himself is inseparable and cannot be broken down into different parts or different aspects. However, as humans, we experience God in different ways. And we give names to those different experiences and revelations of God. And therefore, when the Mekubalim give these 10 Sefirot, they're not talking about God himself. Rather, the human experience, or even the angel's experience, sometimes it's the more exact term would be creation, spiritual, physical included, creation's experience of God. That can be broken down to different types of revelation, different levels of revelation, but it's not different revelations of God himself. So if we sum up what the two topics we discussed in this segment so far, we talked about the question, does God have an image or not? We saw that even though the many psukim describe God as having an image, if it is accepted beyond doubt that God does not have an image, and the Rambam went as far as saying that it was kfirah to even fathom that. Regarding the second concept of God, we know God is one. We explained that God is not only does it mean God is one in numbers, one source to all creation, rather that God's entity is one and not can be separated into various parts. How does that work with the Kabbalistic concept of Sefirot, different revelations of God? According to many rabbis, it does not. But according to most modern, or even less modern, from the Machal onward, there is no contradiction, because the Sefirot are talking about God's revelations and not God himself. The reason it's important to emphasize this, and this is one of the dangers that is many times discussed amongst rabbis, why it's dangerous to learn Kabbalah, is because if you misunderstand this concept of Sefirot as talking about God himself and not as God's revelation, then you do become a kofer, an idol worshiper. And that's one of the dangers of learning Jewish mysticism. A small misunderstanding makes you from a believer into chas v'chelera, one who believes in something that is not true. And B'ezrat Hashem, we all want to stick to the truth. In the next segment, we'll go deeper into our understanding in God. Thank you very much.